good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our discussion of Dr. Ann Duncan's book, Sacred Pregnancy, Birth, Motherhood, and the Quest for Spiritual Community. This book talk is hosted by the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies, an organization dedicated to creating space for interreligious engagement so that religious difference can become a powerful force for good. I'm Christine Krieger, the Program Director for Congregations here at ICJS, and I am thrilled to be in the company of Dr. Ann Duncan, Professor of American Studies and Religion at Goucher College in Baltimore, Maryland, and the author of this absolutely wonderful book. So Ann's research and teaching focus on intersections of religion and public life, including religion and politics, new religious movements, the religiously unaffiliated, and of course, motherhood and American religion. Dr. Duncan's courses often integrate community-based learning and interfaith dialogue, as well as exploration of religious diversity within the Baltimore, Maryland area. So Ann and I will start with a conversation about her book, this wonderful, glorious, beautiful book. And there will be an opportunity at the end of the discussion for audience questions. So please feel free to utilize the chat to submit those questions, and staff will collect them throughout the discussion. You'll notice one of the places you can chat to says submit questions here, and that is your place. So please put your questions there. So I've had the privilege of reading Ann's book, and I have to say, Ann, I have told you this already, but I enjoyed it so much. So for those who have not yet had the opportunity to read it, her publisher describes it as, quote, part feminist discourse on motherhood, part sociological study of changing U.S. religious demographics, and part exploration of spiritual movements rooted in women's reproductive health. So to suffice to say, it is a wholly fascinating look at the way that we view community and ritual around pregnancy, birth, and motherhood. And I don't want to tell you too much about it because Ann is here to talk about her work today. So I want to jump right in with some questions for you, Ann, if you are ready.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Fabulous. Perfect. All right. So to get us started, can you tell us a little bit about the book and what led you to this line of research?
Sure. And first of all, thank you, Christine, for the warm welcome and putting all of this together, and ICJS for hosting, and all of you for being here. It's certainly fun to have a community to discuss this book with after spending so much time just me and my computer. So as Christine's description suggests, the book talks about changing paradigms of motherhood in the United States, also changing religious demographics, and in particular, the rise of the unaffiliated, and sort of looking at what religious and spiritual behavior exists outside of the bounds of traditional religion, and the emergence of spiritual birth movements and businesses that are directly responding to, and I think a result of some of those changes. So this book actually has kind of a long history in terms of my own interest in this subject. When I was in graduate school studying American religious history, I also had both of my children at the same time, and so was completely immersed both in the study of religion, but also in cultural discourse around motherhood, and was sort of overwhelmed and also fascinated by all of the books and articles and various experts that would talk about, breastfeeding or bottle feeding, natural parenting, attachment parenting, how to give birth, and all of these types of things. So that really sparked an interest that turned into a dissertation that looked at Mormon, Quaker, and Catholic women and how their faith influenced their decisions around pregnancy and birth. So more recently, I've been doing a lot more on new religious movements and the spiritual but not religious. And one day came across an article about the sacred living movement, which is an important part of this book, and sort of went down a rabbit hole, learning more about what they did, found a local movement, a local group that I was able to meet some of the members of and participate in some of their events. And it just sort of continued on from there. It was clear there was something very unique happening in this group and elsewhere.
Yeah. And for those of you who have read the book, you're familiar with the sacred living movement. And for those of you who haven't, Anne really goes into depth about everything that they have as their mission and their practices. And it's all very interesting. So thank you. So in this book, you talk a lot about meaning making and the reason really for creating and doing rituals. So what is it about pregnancy and childbirth that draws so many people to ritual?
Yeah, so I think, if you look back at the earliest human societies, there are rituals around pregnancy and birth. And I think what is striking in the modern United States is that for most women, there's not any of that available, whether it's within institutional religion or outside. And often much of the focus is placed on the coming baby in pregnancies. We think about baby showers, for example, where you get diapers and clothing and things like that. And there's attention paid to the mother, but not necessarily so much in terms of the transition that she is making through becoming a mother. And I think the experience of pregnancy and birth are so kind of all-encompassing. There's the physical aspect, if we're talking about biological motherhood, the very physical and very dramatic experience of childbirth itself. It's emotional, not just because of all the hormones, but because of the huge change of life. And people have long described it as a potentially spiritual or even traumatic experience. So it has the potential to bring some of the highest highs and lowest lows that a person experiences in their life. And more than anything, I think it marks a real sort of rite of passage from one stage of life to another. And so in the United States, we have a medical system that has made the experience of pregnancy and childbirth more isolated than it is in many other parts of the world and at many other times in history. More medicalized. So, we think about pregnancy and birth as a medical condition, right? Mm-hmm. Rather than something a little more holistic or natural. And many religious institutions do not provide regular rituals or community around these experiences, especially if they're smaller and just don't have enough people sort of at that particular stage to support it. So I think there's this need for meaning making and ritual is not something exclusive to pregnancy and birth, but it's not, to me, surprising at all that this is a place where a lot of this activity has really focused.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that just makes so much sense. It's just one of these life transitions that you're right. We overlook mothers in favor of looking at the baby and the new life, which is really exciting. And also there is a group of people that's really getting lost in that. So
right.
Yeah, it's really important.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So you're talking a little bit about the religion and religious spaces. And obviously at ICJS, we're very interested in the religion and the religious spaces. So in the second chapter of your book, you explored the reality of our religious and spiritual landscape in the U.S., pointing to the fact that people have really pulled away from institutional religion and redefined themselves as spiritual but not religious, which is the phrase that you used earlier. So then as these women go through this, process of pregnancy and birth, they crave this ritual and a transformational religious type experience, really. So do you get the sense then that this is creating another type of religion, one around a lived experience? And kind of a second part to that, do you think that we have made motherhood a religion of sorts, or do you think it's something different?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think even as this book is very much a study of some small and very unique communities, it's also speaking to some of these definitions of religion and spirituality. And I'm not going to provide a very, a clear and definitive definition now. I think there probably as many definitions of these terms as there are people who study them. But I like to think about William James and his sort of definitions of what he calls religious experience, which I think in many ways are descriptions of spirituality. And he talks about experiences that individuals have on their own in solitude, connecting with whatever they consider to be the divine or sacred. And it's when people share similar experiences of the sacred that they might combine together and create what we often think of as religions, which are more structured, often have doctrine, specific rituals that they follow. And so what we're seeing in the United States are some dramatic changes in the numbers of religious adherents. And so the Pew Research Center, the Public Religion Research Institute have issued a number of important studies over the last 10 years or so. And I know Robbie Jones came to ICJS a few years ago to speak about this. And I use a lot of his work pretty heavily in that second chapter. But what they're finding is that, yes, church attendance is going down and, some of these other numbers are shifting. But one of the most interesting aspects, I think, is that the number of people who are unaffiliated or disaffiliating, so leaving religion, is dramatically rising, particularly among younger people. And what I think is often missed is that these people who are leaving, either leaving institutional religion or just refraining from defining themselves as a member. So, when you hear the phrase religious nuns, Nones, it's referring to people who, if they are given a survey asking their religious identification, would say none or none of the above. And what's often missed is that the vast majority of those folks are not atheists, would not even call themselves agnostic. They just don't, for whatever reason, and it might be politics, it might be American individualism, who knows, don't want to put themselves in that box. And many, if not most of them, believe in something like God, want ritual, want community. And so one of my most central questions in my research is, so where are they finding it? Because if we study just religion in terms of institutional religion that keeps, membership logs and things like that, we are going to miss so much religious and spiritual activity that's out there in the world. And so movements like these that I'm studying, that I'm calling spiritual birth movements, and the sacred living movement is a good example of that, are very clear to say that they are not a religion. And part of that is strategic, because that means that people who are members of religion, people who are not, can come and take part and don't feel like it's an exclusive commitment that then, disqualifies them from, membership in their synagogue or their church. But it also means that this is attractive to people who do not want institutional religion, want something else. And so there's a kind of radical openness that these movements and services provide that makes space for anyone who might find meaning. And what that means is that there's not usually a set doctrine. There's not any kind of requirement for regular practice. And this, I think, allows for a lot of these religious nuns, a lot of these spiritual but not religious, to find some meaningful ritual and community within. So one example, I mentioned the sacred living movement a couple times, but for those who haven't read the book, this is a movement that was started by a woman named Annie Dalter, who, while pregnant with one of her children, noticed the way that during a pregnancy yoga class, the most meaningful part of that hour was the tea break that they took at the end, where everyone just stood around sort of talking about their experiences and connecting with one another. And so she wanted to create some more spaces like that. And so she started with these sacred pregnancy retreats. And this is how I first sort of found out about this movement. And these are opportunities for pregnant women to come together and engage in all kinds of rituals that involve blessing each other, decorating their bellies with paints, adorning everyone with flowers and various things to sort of make them look like goddesses. And a lot of different rituals to sort of mark this coming transition in the person's life. And they'll do things like draw tarot cards or do meditations and other things that might be offensive to some people, and so they allow them to not participate. There are other opportunities for people to sort of drop in their own specific religious or spiritual beliefs to make that ritual more meaningful for them. And so that's a kind of flexibility that I think you don't generally find in more institutionalized religions. And so I think these groups would say they are not a religion, and I don't think it's particular to motherhood, this kind of activity that I'm noticing in these groups. But at the same time, when I talk to folks about the meaning of these groups, when I sit in and observe something, I do have that phrase, if it looks like a duck, quacks like a duck, at what point is it a duck, right?
Yeah.
And I think that just sort of speaks to the insufficiency of language, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, these terms are very changeable. So I would hesitate to call it a religion, but there's a lot of religious-like activity happening.
I know after I read it and I was talking to family and friends about it, and I was trying to explain these movements, and they said, okay, so they're filling a void. And I said, well, yes and no, because there's this space for religion, but also, there are people who are religious who are doing it. So some people already have a religion they identify with, and some people don't. So it's not a religion, but it is. So that was a really helpful explanation of that, and trying to explain that it is really hard to figure out exactly what that space is.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. So in thinking, kind of going along with that, you said in the book, I was really struck by this statement. You said, make sure I read it so that I don't get it wrong. But you said that these movements are, quote, existing at the intersection of marketplace of religion and marketplace of pregnancy and childbirth. So my question then, do you think these movements are part of a wave of capitalism and spirituality working in tandem, or do you think that this is the next step in some way in this, popular religious and spiritual movement?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, in some ways, this gets back to the question of how do these groups differ from religion? And one of the most striking examples that I think might immediately come to mind is the fact that they charge money for these different retreats and such. And, it's hard to imagine how they could not charge money because they're often at locations and they offer wonderful food and, all of these other benefits that you might get from any other kind of retreat or vacation or something. And they offer trainings and things like that also cost money, but also have the potential to allow people to create businesses, providing some of these services and facilitating these rituals for other people. And so that kind of overt financial element is definitely different from how we often think about religion in the United States. But at the same time, it's not like churches and synagogues and mosques and temples don't require money, right, to keep the lights on and to pay their staff and all of the rest. It's just often handled and collected in different ways. So I think that's one element here. There's a lot of marketing that goes on, particularly with Sacred Living Movement. One of the ways they do that is through the use of beautiful photography. So the founder actually has a background in interior design and a real eye for detail and for creating beautiful spaces and images. And so if you go on any of their websites or social media, you will just be overwhelmed by just the beauty of what's happening at these retreats and the fact that there's a professional photographer there at every retreat is sort of another interesting element in terms of what's happening in that space.
I did notice that in looking at the website and all that. It's like, oh, this is very cultivated, like this image. Mm-hmm.
Yes, very cultivated, but also super attractive, right? Like if you're a heavily pregnant person who's feeling swollen and just not yourself and all of this, and you see this image of an also very heavily pregnant woman, looking like a goddess, an actual goddess, like of course you would want that. I would like to look like that.
I looked at one thing and thought, wow, I never looked or felt like that while I was pregnant. Like there's no way that would have been nice.
Right. I'll have what she's having. Right. Yeah. Yeah. So, I think there is a lot of work that's been done on spirituality and the marketplace in America. There are a lot of books on this. Andrea Jane has done some really great work on yoga and how that's been commercialized. You only need to go to a store and see namaste coffee mugs and overpriced yoga gear to see that in action. But I think there's something new and different here in these groups. and that they are sort of without any self-consciousness, very clear that these are also businesses, but they are providing services that aren't being provided by our medical system, by certain religious communities. And so they are filling a void in that way in terms of services that people want and need, and are in many ways very willing to pay for. So there are a few kind of upended paradigms here that these groups are sort of shifting. One has to do with finances. The other has to do with space. Because most of these movements, with the exception of the businesses that I profile in the DC area that provide particular services to support birth or doing womb steaming and things like this, they have actual storefronts. But the sacred living movement, Amy Wright Glenn and her work on pregnancy loss, there's not a brick and mortar center. These things happen online, they happen at destinations. And that too is a different way of thinking about how community can be created. And it makes it more accessible to a broader range of people and allows these groups to exist, even if there's not enough of a community in their immediate local area. It makes it global, and so enables work to happen and community to form, even when you are sort of a minority perspective.
Yeah, and even you writing about, like, in COVID times when everything was shutting down and people were moving to virtual spaces, and these, institutional religions and all these spaces were needing to convert really quickly. This movement just kind of kept going and growing because it had created and carved out a space for itself in this more global community.
Absolutely. Yeah. So it felt like a lot of religious groups were kind of catching up to what some of these groups are already doing. And I think the sacred living movement has been fascinating to watch because they have just been evolving over time to have the retreats, yes, but also more and more trainings to sort of equip people to do this work out in the community. And one of the things I chronicle in the book is my own experience going through the online training to be a postpartum doula, essentially. They call it a mother roaster, which I still haven't gotten a clear answer on why they call it that. But I learned how to make all kinds of special teas and foods that are particularly nourishing for a mother right after giving birth. There's certain rituals like creating a beautiful journal that you then use to record the mother's birth story for her. Different dried flower concoctions that you use to make a bath for the mother soon after birth. And various things you might do with the umbilical cord or binding the belly, all kinds of different things that are really focused on reflection and care for both the physical and the emotional, spiritual sort of side of that experience. And so I was able to do that all from home. And with that experience could, hang up my shingle and offer these services to other women. And so it's an interesting sort of business model that's also about sort of spreading these practices, making them more available to more people, to do what the founder says of sort of wanting to infuse the sacred into more aspects of our life. So, it's hard not to draw parallels with other types of, missionary work that people might do and other ways of sort of training religious leaders in various ways. It looks a whole lot different, but I wonder if there are more parallels that might be immediately evident.
Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about you mentioned this kind of providing a service that healthcare doesn't offer and that giving people the choice to do that. And so you note in the book that the language of choice around motherhood really is coded with both race and class implications. So can you talk more about that and how you see those dynamics playing out in the movements you studied?
Absolutely. Right. So this marketplace language, all about choice, and Americans generally want to have lots of choices and want to map out their own individual path. And motherhood is really ripe with all of a variety of different kinds of choices people might have about how they want to give birth, how they want to mother, whether they want to work or stay home, whatever it might be. And so often those discussions assume that all of those choices are equally available to everyone, and they absolutely are not. I mean, a lot has been written about, for example, breastfeeding and bottle feeding. So if you don't have a choice about whether or not to go right back to work after you've given birth, even if you choose to breastfeed, if you need to pump regularly, there are only certain jobs that might afford you the opportunity to actually do that. And you might have to use your entire lunch break to do that and do it in a bathroom stall. I mean, and not have anywhere in which you can store the milk. So there are a lot of sort of socioeconomic kind of restrictions to these choices. So a lot of that choice language sort of assumes that people have a kind of financial and family stability to be able to make these choices, educate themselves on it, get the kind of supports they need to make it successful. And so that's been very much top of mind in thinking about how these movements themselves talk about choice. Because on the one hand, some of these groups, like the Sacred Living Movement, which is predominantly white, and its retreats are expensive. The local movements and their work is much more accessible. But even if that picture of that beautiful goddess pregnant woman is attractive to, many people, there are only some whom they can take that time off, fly to wherever this retreat is, pay the hundreds or thousands of dollars for it, and have that experience. So it is kind of radically open to everyone on the one hand in terms of religious identification, but restricted due to financial reasons, life circumstances, certainly. There's also a way in which these movements in focusing on pregnancy and birth are necessarily restrictive because not all people, not all women are able to or want to be pregnant or give birth. And so there's another kind of restriction that sort of comes in that way as well. So the other end of the spectrum, another group that another couple of practitioners that I look at that I mentioned before that are in the DC area, these are Black women who have opened these clinics essentially in areas that are predominantly populated by women of color. And, in writing about and studying those groups, I certainly had in mind all of the statistics that have been coming out about Black maternal health and the dramatic and horrifying statistics showing how much worse the medical outcomes for Black women are when pregnant and giving birth. And so what these groups are offering, one practitioner offers sort of spiritual doula services where she accompanies women through the process of birth, gives them out of hospital options where they can be more heard and more readily responded to. But also the woman who does these womb steaming services. This practice of vaginal steaming is something that you see in a number of different cultures throughout history. But what she does is she offers spiritual counseling while offering these services. And she has a whole suite of services for postpartum women as well. And so it's this combination of the physical and the spiritual work happening at the same time. And so those two businesses, I would say, are very much responding to the lack of choice and to the inequity in our different systems in a very direct way and trying to fill a void that they would say should be filled by, insurance covered medical care. But it's not. And so I think that language of choice is throughout discussions of motherhood in the United States, but also sort of tricky topics to consider in relation to these movements, and I think operate differently depending on the demographics of those who participate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And in thinking, I mean, when we think about choice and motherhood and the US right now, there are certainly a lot of things happening with that. So in the current moment, there is a lot of discussion around religion and pregnancy and reproductive rights. So do you think that your book fits into this conversation?
I hope so. As I was finishing the book, Roe was overturned, and so I couldn't help but reflecting on that a little bit in the conclusion, because I think the book is so much about pregnant and birthing people taking control over these processes and making meaning out of them. And I think even the title of the book could suggest a certain take on this topic. And I think part of that is because in the United States, when we elevate pregnancy in some way or childbirth in some way, it's often done towards a pro-life, anti-abortion position. You raise these things up to restrict, the ending of a pregnancy, for example. I think something very different is happening here. These groups do not, to my knowledge and in my conversations with these folks, talk directly about reproductive rights, but so much of their work is about honoring and caring for the pregnant birthing person. And it's about having autonomy and control over those rites of passage and making them very intentional and full of meaning. And that sort of requires that a person's entrance into that rite of passage be a choice or something that they are doing willingly. And so these movements, I think, are intentionally non-political. But what I think they do is sort of point to a shifting kind of paradigm of motherhood as a political identity. I think just as I mentioned that idea of sacred pregnancy before, traditionally in the United States, we see a lot of the discussion about motherhood and womanhood in politics and religion coming from a more conservative Christian perspective, where you're elevating a very particular understanding of the family and of womanhood. And I think what's happening increasingly is that motherhood is being used as a political identity in support of more progressive causes. And so thinking about, back a number of years, thinking about PFLAG, thinking about more recently Moms Demand Action, the coalition of mothers of some of the many unarmed Black men who have been killed by police and others. This identity as a mother is starting to be used in a more vocal and more visible way to advocate for certain policies. And I think reproductive rights and reproductive choice is very much part of that, just as it is with the gun control debate as well. I mean, I think about the Tennessee Three, those state representatives who spoke out, and two of whom were rejected from the state legislature for a time there. One of the most compelling pictures or videos I saw from that was when they came out and embraced one of the grieving mothers who had just lost a child. And that mother and others were on the front line of those people in the lobby of that legislative house saying, please do something now. And so I think my next project might be exploring that a little bit more, these new paradigms of motherhood as a political identity, because I think there's definitely something there.
And I'm going to speak on behalf of ICJS. I think that is something we'd like to definitely talk to you about after you do that research and learn about that. Yeah, I definitely see that, how motherhood really is this branch of finding this autonomy. So thank you.
Sure.
I want to go back you were talking about the different rituals and the different pieces of these rituals that people are pulling in together. And you mentioned the tarot cards and people, sometimes participating, sometimes not, depending on their comfort levels with things. And so one of the ways in which these movements really defy typical definitions of religion is by avoiding doctrine and then borrowing heavily from a variety of religious traditions. So can you say more about the role of cultural appropriation in these trends you're observing?
Yeah, so this is a huge issue, particularly for the sacred living movement. Their founder describes herself as a pagan Buddhist mix. She's more recently gotten very involved in Wicca and has been offering different retreats on witchcraft and in a variety of ways, and so has really no hesitation from drawing from a number of different traditions. What was interesting is that I found with some of the local leaders and some of the other folks who led some of their different more specialized retreats is a little bit more awareness of that. And I had one of the local leaders tell me that they are very careful to, in her words, sort of not use anything that's not gifted to us, or to be very intentional about talking about the history of a certain practice in some way or another. So on the one hand, you can look at some of these retreats. I mean, even just from looking at some of the pictures, you see, holy powder, you see the tarot cards, you see, statues of Buddha and other sort of religious images. And so on the one hand, it's kind of textbook appropriation of other cultures, and the fact that these are primarily white women who are doing it certainly adds a layer to that. But on the other hand, I think it's not surprising that this has happened, and that we're talking about new movements emerging with no kind of institution behind them to sort of define, these are the things that we have done for centuries within our tradition, and so keep doing those things. They're emerging out of nothing in a way, and so are trying to sort of appeal back to what they see as more ancient traditions that we have moved away from. So I would say most any new religious movement or spiritual movement emerging in the United States is necessarily going to be syncretistic. It's going to be borrowing and blending just because of the environment we're in. We're surrounded by just a multiplicity of different cultures and influences. And the challenge is really how to do so in a way that lifts up some of those communities from whom these ideas come. Because I think some of these practices, we can talk about motherhood and the lack of ritual and community support, but this is not a new issue. That kind of, birthing in community and these different rituals of like social isolation for a certain amount of time after giving birth and, different rituals to sort of mark that rite of passage. These are things that different societies throughout the world have done since the beginning of human society itself. And I think there's certain aspects of our, modern society that have moved us away from that. And so we're necessarily going to be going back. We're not reinventing the wheel here to move towards more of those kinds of opportunities. But again, the challenge is how do you recognize that history and not make it seem as though this is something that you have sort of come up with whole cloth.
Yes. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And then kind of going along with that, in thinking about these practices and really pulling a lot of these female-centered and women-centered pieces from these religions. So you have been, in your book, you really juxtapose the institutional religion with these female-centric practices. So even when they're borrowing, they're really borrowing not the religious men in charge kind of model, but the women who have been highlighted throughout these religions and spiritual practices. So do you think that part of this movement came out of the backlash against kind of Western patriarchal constructs of ritual and importance? Or do you think that this is something that just has been missing for a long time for women, and we're just bringing it back into the forefront?
Probably a little bit of both. I mean, I think there is something particular about this moment in time in the United States. And I think this comes back to how feminism in the United States has handled the issue of motherhood. And I think particularly white, predominantly white feminism has, during the second wave, and I talk about the different waves of feminism in the book, but after the vote was secured and women were starting to sort of want to find more of a place within the working world, and being able to restrict pregnancy and birth was necessary for women to be able to go to school, to go to follow whatever vocation they were interested in. If a person was in a sexually active relationship. And so, the emergence of birth control and Roe versus Wade, all of this was sort of part of that. And the result is that motherhood got a bit of a bad name in terms of being the thing that restricted a woman, so that it became kind of a choice between the two in some sense. And I think what's been interesting is that, more recent expressions of feminism have started to reclaim motherhood as something that can be understood through a feminist perspective, can be experienced and in a very full way alongside of a career. And I point out, that a lot of these conversations are happening with predominantly white feminism, because there have long been Black feminist, womanist theologians and feminists who have looked at this issue a little differently. And one of the reasons why is back to that choice language, sort of recognizing that a lot of the conversations within predominantly white feminist circles made a whole lot of assumptions about the kind of choices that might come with power and privilege that aren't available to everyone. So I think there is something about this moment in time and evolving feminist discourse that makes this particularly appropriate time for these groups to gain in membership and flourish.
Thank you so much. I want to be mindful of our time, and I see on the screen behind me that there are many questions that have come up. So I am going to transition to questions from the audience here. So if you have a question, please submit it through the chat to the one that says submit questions here, and we'll get that on our slate of questions. I also wanted to just point out someone direct messaged me and said that there was just a piece in the Baltimore Sun on this thing about motherhood and political action. So definitely check that out in thinking about how motherhood is becoming this movement in a different way than it ever has before. So the first question that I have for you here is, what are examples of birth rituals in religious traditions? So you mentioned you studied Mormon, Quaker, and Catholic traditions. Are there traditions in those communities?
Yeah, so great question. I'm going back a few years in terms of my research, but yeah, it's that was fascinating because these are very unique kinds of Christian communities for sure. And what was interesting in interviewing women from all three of those traditions is that I didn't hear a lot about sort of standardized rituals, but I did hear some difference in terms of how their certain religious ideology and sort of worldview influenced their thinking about what the birth experience meant, what it might be like, and what, if any, its theological significance might be. And so there's also certainly difference in terms of the kinds of institutional supports there were. So certainly for Catholic and Mormon, the Catholic and Mormon women I spoke to, since both of those traditions have such a strong emphasis on the family and on procreation as sort of part of the purpose of the family, a lot of women's groups, a lot of sort of support, community support was often built in. But I'll just give just a short example in terms of different interpretations of the birth experience. So Mormonism has very distinctive ideas about what is actually happening in pregnancy and birth. And it involves the sort of embodiment of one of God's spirit children. And so one woman described it to me as like these little spirit children that pre-exist, the marriage that brings them into the world. But it's like they're sitting on a bench at a Little League game or something, just sort of waiting for their turn to come up and bat. And it's when a couple, marries and creates this sort of vessel in which that child can come into being, that God sort of sends them down. And it's actually through the woman's body, through pregnancy and birth. And so that elevates pregnancy to such a special and important status. And so even as that tradition is, can be seen as rather patriarchal and very much focused on distinct gender roles, that role of mother is so deeply important and vital for the continuation of the human race and, the continuation of God's plan on earth. And kind of on the other end of the spectrum, I had some Quaker women, one in particular I remember, who was very much influenced by Ina May Gaskin, who wrote these different books. She's sort of maybe the most famous midwife in the United States, and ran this kind of commune for pregnant and birthing women in Tennessee. And she wrote this book, Spiritual Midwifery, which if you ever have a chance to look through, it's quite a time capsule. But it sort of talks about pregnancy as this opportunity to get closer with your spouse and to have a kind of ecstatic experience of joy and, just sort of very high expectations for what in particular a natural childbirth can bring. And so I talked to a couple women who are very influenced by that and then sort of had a bit of a challenge when the birth didn't quite go that way and sort of reconciling that with their own sense of self and worldview. So yeah, a lot there. I could talk all day about my conversations with those women, but really interesting comparisons for sure.
Wonderful. Thank you. Let's see, our next question here. So there are often connections between similar spiritual and wellness type activities with anti-vax type beliefs. Do these groups tend to foster beliefs along those lines?
Not that I'm aware of. They certainly don't publicize that in any way. And what's interesting is that you would think, particularly with the sacred living movement, that they would be very kind of doctrinal about the idea of natural childbirth, because it has a lot of similarities to other groups that do advocate that. But they don't sort of prescribe any particular kind of mothering or birth experience. They provide a certain kind of experience in these retreats, but they do not suggest anything about how you should birth, for example, whether it's, okay to use medication or not. It's really about what feels best for you. And Annie Dalter told me at one point, she's like, I don't care if you give birth in a pool with dolphins, however you do it, it's all about what feels right and empowering for you. And so all of that to say that I see a kind of hesitancy to be very cut and dried about any kind of choice involving pregnancy and motherhood. And it's sort of interesting to see how they can still maintain any kind of unity without some of those guidelines and shared beliefs, but they're doing it.
Yeah, which really does point back to the impact, I think, of pregnancy and motherhood and the need for something there that doesn't really matter what other things you're coming with. This is important enough that we're just all sticking together for that.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
So the next question is about the leadership structures in these retreats. So what are the leadership structures like in these spiritual retreats? Are there similarities to multi-level marketing structures where investing more money means rising in the hierarchy?
So I think I have gotten, little moments where I see some similarities with multi-level marketing, but they are not structured in that way. So I mentioned that the postpartum training that I took part in, I paid to participate. There were some costs involved in creating the various salves and, dried herbs and various things that I use to create the different products that I would then use. But beyond that, you don't have to continue to pay anything. I think there is a small fee if you want to be listed on their list of kind of trained providers, which makes sense, I think. In terms of leadership, so the sacred living movement is really interesting in that it is absolutely the brainchild of a very charismatic, free-spirited person who has her hands in everything. That said, she has sort of deputized a number of people to lead certain parts. So, for example, I mentioned the sacred mother or sacred pregnancy. They also have a sacred motherhood, sacred milk that's about breastfeeding. They have one on menopause. They have a number of different retreats that have developed that are often led by someone else who has, suggested this and developed a program for it. And so there's sort of a second level there. There are also some local movements, some of whom have direct and official ties, some of whom have kind of separated, but are still doing some similar things. So it's a bit diffuse. There is not a financial scheme going on as far as I can tell, but there definitely are charges for services.
Okay. And that answered another question about once part of these communities, are there other opportunities for women to remain connected? And it sounds like there are through these other movements with, having a small child and then going through these stages of kind of these rituals associated with womanhood. So I think maybe we have time for one more question. So how does the trans experience fit into these types of spiritual retreats? And are they open to trans men and non-binary pregnant people?
Yes, great question. And, early in the book, I definitely make the caveat that I use the language of woman and women frequently throughout the book, but also recognize that women aren't the only pregnant and birthing people. And one of the things that has been interesting to see is that these groups, as far as I can tell, are very open to anyone who would like to participate. And when you talk about a sacred pregnancy retreat, obviously there is some expectation that those who are attending are pregnant, however they identify in terms of their gender. So it's both very open and exclusionary in terms of what might, cause you to go to one of these retreats. But yeah, this sort of goes along with the, not prescribing any particular way of, giving birth or being pregnant or anything like that. There is a kind of openness. And I think some local groups have also had some kind of spin-off groups, some smaller groups that have developed and formed for people who are non-conforming to sort of those traditional two categories. So I would say it's more dependent upon, the reproductive organs you have in terms of the pregnancy and birthing piece, rather than sort of how you present yourself, how you identify in the broader social sphere. So yeah, pretty open and inclusive in that way, but also necessarily exclusive in some others.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for telling us all about the book and, giving us this overview of it. We do have a lot more questions. I will say we have a lot of questions. Thank you all for your questions. And a lot of them are answered in the book. So this book, Sacred Pregnancy by Ann Duncan. So we're fortunate to get a discount from the publisher. So Ann's publisher, Fortress Press, has provided us with a 25% off discount on this book. So if you would like to get it, you can just use that QR code or go to the Fortress Press website. Make sure that you use the promo code ICJS 25 at checkout, and you'll get 25% off of the list price until May 31st at 11:59 p.m. Also, we are so glad that you're here, and we'd love you to come back for other things. We'd also love to know what you thought of this and what you'd like to see in the future. So when you exit this Zoom, A prompt will open in your browser window with a link to a survey about this event. Please complete it while this event is still fresh. Please, please, please. We value all of your opinions on our programming. We want to make sure that we're offering things that you are looking forward to. So we'd love your ideas and suggestions. You can always visit our website, icjs.org, to donate, subscribe to our email list, and learn about upcoming programs. If you would like to donate, we'd love that. ICJS is non-sectarian and independent. We are unaffiliated with any academic, religious, political organization. We're supported by people like you. So while we strive to make all of our programming available at no cost, we ask for your support in making our work possible. You can subscribe on our website also for our emails, so you can get notified about all of the upcoming events and programs. And finally, you can see on the screen here, we'd love for you to save the date for our June online event. It will be at noon on June 27th, and it will be an event titled Race, Trauma, and Healing, Insights from Jewish Anti-Racism Practitioners. We'd love to see you there. Thank you so, so much. I hope you'll have a wonderful day. And thank you, Anne. Everyone get a copy of this book if you have not yet, and hopefully we'll see you at another event, or we'll start a book club and I'll read it together later. But thank you so much. Have a good day.